Assalamu alaikum, this is Dr. Mona Al-Idrisi, author of the Muslim Narcissist book and empowerment coach for Muslims. Today's podcast is a Q&A as a follow-up to the previous podcast about narcissistic Muslim preachers and teachers. So usually after a heavy podcast, I receive some questions that I would like to share the answers to out of hope that it will benefit other people, inshallah. So do listen to the end. I have dropped some of the questions below in the description box so you can get an idea of the kinds of questions people have been asking. So let's jump into the first question, which is, what do you do if a narcissist in your family is committing crimes but they are in dawah? So here I'd say it depends on the crime, because some crimes need to be approached differently to others. And you also need to determine if the public is being affected by these crimes. So, for example, charity fraud. Let's say you're seeing lots of people donate loads of money out of hope that this money is going to the poor and needy in sadaqah. But you know for a fact that the person who is running this charity in your family is pocketing the money, and the money is not going to the poor and needy. Here, you go to the relevant authorities and report the scam. Okay, don't take it upon yourself to go on Instagram or YouTube with your speaker to expose this person, because I promise you, if you expose a narcissist in public like that, it will backfire on you heavily. You need to take it to the relevant authorities for them to deal with it, because they're responsible for these types of scams and cases and problems. And this is the safest way, because it's anonymous. When you go to report someone to the child protection authorities or social services or the police or fraud departments, then you'll be protected, because many of these tip-offs are anonymous. And in some unfortunate cases, you will have to be known as a witness to the crime that you have exposed. So just make sure that if you do go to the authorities and you do need to be called up as a witness in court for anything, that you have a very good support system behind you, because you're going to need as much support as you can get when you have to face the anger of the narcissist, who is super angry that you've exposed them. But when it comes to matters like child abuse, you have a moral obligation to expose them. Because not only is this a serious crime, but if it's not stopped, then other people can be encouraged to do the same. Okay? When people see that others have gotten away with it, then they continue with their crimes as well. And they'll just continue traumatising so many children and making them hate Islam so much. So you'll be doing a great humanitarian service by reporting these people to the right authorities. Now, before you do any of that, if the narcissist knows that you know what they're doing, or if you've caught them red-handed, then get a mediator involved, okay? Because now the narcissist will know that if the authorities contact him, then it's highly likely that it was you who filed the complaint about him. Okay, so when you know that he knows that you know, then get someone involved to advise him and shake him up and remind him to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if he doesn't, then make sure you have your support system in place. Because believe me, if you don't, you're going to get it. You really will get it. And that's why the wife of the Quran teacher who exposed him is considered to be very brave. Okay, because this is something she should do anyway. But not everyone is brave to expose the narcissists and their families out of fear. And especially if they don't have backup and they don't have support. So if they have enablers in the family who are covering up the crimes of these narcissists, then it's really difficult for someone to come out and expose somebody, because they know that everyone will gang up on them for doing that. So your first point of call, when they know that you know, is to get someone involved from the family. Okay, maybe get your father involved, or his father, or his uncles, and explain what you've seen, or what you've heard, and if he does not fear Allah and he continues, then it has to go to the authorities. But try and keep it within the family first, just in case he repents and feels ashamed and all of that. Okay, you don't want to go to the authorities straight away. Someone has to advise him first within the family. And if that doesn't work, then go to the authorities. But do not expose him yourself on social media, on YouTube, and on other platforms, because it's not safe to do so. And if you are living with a malignant narcissist, the worst ones, the psychopaths, and you have found out that this psychopath is sexually abusing children, grooming vulnerable women, taking advantage of his authority as a judge or as an imam, then you can submit an anonymous tip-off to the authorities without getting anyone involved, because mediation doesn't work with these people. You will put yourself in danger when a malignant narcissist or a psychopath knows that you know. Okay, sometimes people will do things to get rid of you if they know that you know. So pretend that you haven't seen anything, play dumb, and just go to the relevant authorities to safeguard yourself. Okay, and let them deal with it. And if you really are in a situation where you can't expose them at all, and you feel so much guilt for not being able to do so, but you are terrified of doing it because of what could happen to you, then just make loads of dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposes this person for what they're doing. And either way, okay, regardless of whatever decision you choose to take, know that it's an obligation upon every Muslim to expose those who are a danger or a threat to public health or safety, and that's spiritually, physically, and psychologically. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, Ayah 135, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلوا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. O believers, stand firm for justice as witnesses for Allah, even if it is against yourselves or your parents or your close relatives. Be they rich or poor, Allah is best to ensure their interests. So do not let your desires cause you to deviate from justice. If you distort the testimony or refuse to give it, then know that Allah is certainly all aware of what you do. So this is something that a lot of preachers don't teach you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us here that even if it's our parents who are the corruptors and the oppressors and they are committing crimes, we must hold them to account. Okay, we don't hear people saying that. But sometimes it's the parents who are malignant and they oppress their children, they harm their children, they commit crimes against their children. And Allah's telling the believers, call them out on it. Because they have to stand for justice. Okay? When it comes to oppression, there is no, this is my father, this is my mother, this is my uncle, this is my brother, this is my husband. No. When there's oppression and criminal activity, it doesn't matter who it is. The believer must stand for justice. Because if the believers don't do this, it just enables them to continue. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to do this as well, so that people don't lose their iman in the process. So this is evidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not want us to live with criminals and oppressors. He wants us to stand up to it so that it stops. So every preacher who has ever told you that this is something you have to bear and live with and stay silent on because they're your parents or your close relatives, they're wrong. And this ayah is great evidence for that. So yes, sometimes we might be tested with narcissistic family members. We know that some people have this trial, but it doesn't mean that we can't stand up to them. And actually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to stand up for justice when we see criminal activity or oppression. Because the identity of a Muslim believer is a strong one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create us to stay silent out of weakness or become cowards. Okay, because we are scared of narcissistic individuals. I've taught you enough to know that these individuals are only people who are controlled by their qareens. They will admire you when you stand up for yourself in secret. They have that secret respect for you when you stand up for yourselves. They actually loathe you when you can't. They despise you when you show cowardice, because it's a reflection of their own weakness. Okay, they're unable to stand up for themselves against their own demons. So when they see a strong character in someone, they admire that in secret. And the most important thing is that when you stand up for yourself and for others, you establish very strong boundaries and you send a clear message that, they're not going to get away with this behavior and these crimes. So not only are you protecting yourself and your family, you're protecting other people as well by standing up for justice and establishing the right boundaries. Okay, there are people who need to be exposed. Don't fear that, because of the greater good that will come out of it, inshallah. Look, I know there are so many people out there who hate my guts. I know they can't stand me. I know they seethe every time I release a podcast because I'm exposing narcissistic behavior. I'm opening people's eyes to narcissistic abuse and the demons they're living with. But I also know that if I don't release this knowledge about narcissists and codependence and everything I speak about, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold me accountable for withholding knowledge from people who could use it to save their own lives. And there are narcissists who are benefiting from this information because for the first time they've been able to understand what's happening to them from a spiritual and religious perspective. So, do I have haters? Plenty. I know this. But I'm merely just fulfilling an Islamic obligation upon me, because we need more people to be aware of who narcissists are and what narcissistic abuse looks like. And they also need to know how codependency is crippling them as Muslim believers. It's making them weak. It's making them submit to demonic people, and it's causing them to lose their iman, their mental health, their physical health, and so on. It's not worth it. Okay? Sometimes even the good you do will attract a lot of people who will hate you for it, but that's not your problem. Okay? Keep your intention pure for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He will protect you from all evil, inshallah. So, some people have narcissistic husbands, wives, family members who are in dawah and they teach Quran. They might be judges, scholars, imams, and so on, and they're only abusive at home and not in public. So if that's the case, then just get mediators involved to solve family issues. So for example, you'll have someone who is a preacher and everyone loves him. He's super nice, he's funny, he's got a great character, and he's got hundreds and thousands of followers. And he's preaching to people and teaching them about the rights of the wife and how to treat your husband and how to treat your children and how to be an amazing family man and so on and so forth. But at home, he's a savage Satan Yahoo. And it's something that people would never assume of him because he's so great in public. So in these cases, when the abuse is not taken to the public, then try and resolve it within the family. And of course, if there's physical violence and so on, and male relatives are not stepping up to the plate to sort this out, then by all means get the relevant authorities involved. I get so many people telling me that they hate their fathers and their husbands and their brothers and their uncles so much because what they see on social media is not who they really are. And they feel sick when they see them preach about being a family man and, how to treat your wife. And it's the best of speech. But at home, they're beating their wives, they're abusing their wives, they're beating their children, they're horrible to their parents. They're a completely different person behind closed doors. And loads of people suffer when they see this, right? You see them as completely different people and you think, well, they have the ability to be nice. They know what they're doing because they are preaching the right knowledge about marriage. And that's how you know that their abuse is by choice. Okay, it's not that they're insane and that they've got some disorder that they can't get over. They choose who to be nice with. They choose what character they have in front of others. And they choose who they want to abuse. So narcissists can be good people if they want to be, but they choose not to be. And they're only nice in front of other people in public because they gain so much from it. They gain the admiration, they gain love, they gain praise, they gain fame, perhaps money and status and whatnot. So when they put on that facade of them being super nice, then know that there's a huge benefit in there for them, for their ego. But home is the only place where they can truly be themselves. So as soon as they walk through that front door, the mask has to slip off because they have spent all day carrying it and it's heavy. So they expect their family members to put up with it because you owe them now a space where they can be themselves. And if you dare bring it up and say, well, how come you can be so nice to other people and you're horrible to us? Oh, they'll punish you with a narcissistic rage. And they'll put the blame on you and they'll say, because of you, I'm not like that. People are nice to me outside, but because you don't do this and because you do that, I'm horrible to you. They'll blame you for it, even though they don't have the right. It's just because they don't want to be nice. They have to have a place where they can be themselves. So they will avoid all accountability and they will always make it your fault that they are that nasty to you. So that's just a little side note for you to understand why there are loads of people like this. They're so different in public from the way they are at home. But it is proof that if they want to be nice and make that effort, they can. But if they're nice with everyone, then they no longer have a punching bag to come home to. And that's why I tell people all the time to not waste their lives, living with these people when it can be avoided. Because the worst people to live with are hypocrites and oppressors, right? Even if those hypocrites and oppressors are your own parents, it can become very difficult to maintain a good relationship with them. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ encouraged people to stand up for justice, but in a good way. Okay, don't be savage when you stand up for justice or for yourselves. There is an Islamic way of doing it, so you don't turn into narcissists yourselves in the process. Okay, so don't be rude when you do it. The whole point in standing up for justice in Islam is to encourage and remind people to fear Allah and amend their ways so that they can gain the rewards of being good people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 2, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ شَدِيدُ الْعِقَابِ. O believers, cooperate with one another in goodness and righteousness, and do not cooperate in sin and transgression, and be mindful of Allah. Surely Allah is severe in punishment. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us here, do not be enablers of sin and transgression and oppression and injustice and all of that. Okay, we can't be enablers as believers. So holding people accountable for their sins and transgressions is important for Muslims. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that even Muslim leaders who are openly sinful are to be held accountable. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, إن من أعظم الجهاد كلمة عدل عند سلطان جائر. Verily, among the greatest acts of jihad is a word of justice before a tyrannical ruler. This is Sahih Hadith. Okay, so standing up for justice, calling people out, exposing people if need be, is all important. Just don't go on a slandering smear campaign of someone whom you know is sinful. Let the authorities deal with that person. So, moving on to the next question, which is, how do I know which is the right Islam to follow? And this question was asked by a revert who has found it very confusing learning about Islam because of all the different sects and their beliefs and different practices and so on. So I'll teach you what I was taught at Mecca University, and that is to simply follow the Quran and Sunnah. And you start off by learning about Tawheed and Aqidah. So Tawheed means monotheism. So you learn everything to do with worshipping Allah as one God. Okay, you need to perfect this in order to perfect the rest of your deen. And Aqidah is basically everything else in the Quran and Hadiths that teach us how to live as Muslim believers. So these are things such as the 5 pillars of Islam, the 6 pillars of Iman, what's halal, what's haram, and so on. I recommend that you read Kitab al-Tawheed, okay, the book of Tawheed by Sheikh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Okay, this will teach you everything you need to know about worshipping one God. And I recommend the book Al-Aqidah al-Wasatiyah by Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah that gives clear guidance about Aqidah. Okay, there is a translation of it in English, and I found that to be the best book about Aqidah, especially for reverts. It's very easy to understand. And these books are based on the Sunni understanding of Islam because all the research has been derived from authentic Hadith narrations and Quran interpretations by Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So the next question following on from this one is, which madhab do I need to follow? So like I explained before in the previous podcast, the madhab that you follow will depend on the community you belong to or the country you live in. So the 4 madhahib, the 4 schools of thought, are Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki and Hanbali. So there is no right or wrong school to follow. All 4 schools are correct because they all follow the same methodologies when it comes to extracting authentic hadith in order to interpret the Quran properly so that scholars can create authentic fiqh rulings in accordance to the Quran and Sunnah. So after you learn about Tawheed and Aqidah, it's good for you to learn about the opinions of scholars on Islamic matters, because the reason why we have fiqh is because societies keep changing and we need qualified scholars and muftis who learned from the 4 imams to help us implement authentic hadith narrations and Quranic interpretations into our modern day social practices, because we don't live in 7th century Arabia anymore. Okay, so the fiqh will change, but the foundation remains the same. So you can't deviate from an authentic hadith and change its meaning or fabricate something new. You have to stick to the authentic hadith narrations and interpretations of the Quran that all 4 imams agreed on. So for example, all 4 imams agreed that a virgin woman cannot get married without the permission of her wali, who was her father. But modern day scholars understand that there are some fathers who are tyrannical, and they are the ones who are stopping their daughters from getting married unjustly. Okay, so there's no reason for them to stop a marriage except for the fact that they just want these daughters to stay at home and serve them. So as you know, this is haram, but it's a common practice among malignant narcissistic fathers. So authentic scholars who follow the methodologies of the 4 schools of thought can create a fatwa to enable a woman who is a virgin to be married in the presence of another wali, so her elder brother, her uncle, whoever is next in line, so that she doesn't miss out on the opportunity of being married. And this fatwa will also protect her from harm. So it might protect her from falling into zina or being further abused by her father. So it's better that her younger brother is the one who stands in place of her father than for her to face other harm as a result of being prevented from marriage. Now, on that note, it's important for you to know that there are some Salafis who only follow muhaddiths and not fuqaha. So they do reject the 4 schools of thought because they don't believe in fiqh. They believe that every hadith narration that is authentic or weak and every Quran verse is to be understood literally. So there's no interpretation of them. You take it for its literal meaning, it's black or white. So the hadith that states that a virgin woman cannot get married without the permission of her father is taken literally. If her father's not there, there's no marriage. It doesn't matter who her father is. He could be in a jail cell somewhere. He could be missing, right? He might have abandoned the family and no one knows where he is. The judge will say, unless you bring me a death certificate for him, the brother cannot be her wali. Bring me the father. I've seen this many times. Because the Salafi judge will not agree to a fiqh ruling being applied to this matter. Because he believes that the hadith is to be implemented as stated. Now, this can cause difficulties in the lives of people, and many women have run away from home just so they can get married. So this is why in Islam, fiqh is important, and the rejection of it can cause great harm to people and society. I'll give you another example of a hadith that was reported by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, who said that the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يحل لامرأة تؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر أن تسافر مسيرة يوم وليلة ليس معها حرمة. It is not lawful for a woman who has faith in Allah and the last day to travel for a day and a night without her guardian. So this is a serious hadith, right? Because the faith of a woman is now connected to her committing this act. Now, you have to understand that back in 7th century Arabia, there were no cars, no planes, no trains, there was nothing apart from camels and horses. Okay, so you needed to ride one of these animals to get to another town, another village. And this could take hours, it could take days for you to get from A to B. So as a woman, you wouldn't even want to travel through the night on your own. It's a no-brainer that you would need a mahram with you in case you get ambushed. There might be wolves out there, there might be scorpions, there might be extreme weather changes, you might get lost. So it's just logical that a woman would need a mahram because Muslim women needed to be protected. No one wants to travel and their camel dies on the way, or you don't find water in the scorching heat and you might faint yourself, right? You might get sick yourself and you're on your own. Or your horse might, get sick and be aggressive and throw you off because it's been scared by something. You're going to be on your own in that situation. And it's out of love and protection for women that he linked this hadith to belief in Allah and their faith. Because he didn't want them to do it. He didn't want them to risk their safety by doing something like this. He wanted them to have male protection if they ever needed to travel. Now these days, because we have public transport and there's airport security and police and safety measures put in place for people, the fuqaha have said that it's okay for a woman to travel with the permission of her guardian on her own to another city or another country within reason. Okay, so she's going to visit her family, for example, and he can't go with her. So she's protected. She's not in danger by travelling. She's getting on a plane. She'll be on that plane for, say, 3 or 4 hours. Maybe she's going to another state, which will take 2 hours. And then she gets to the airport and her family meet her there. She's not getting on a camel and riding through the desert in the middle of the night anymore. So fiqh has been applied here because of the changes that have happened in technology, in society, and transport has been made safer for women. However, the Salafis who only follow the hadiths will say no. They will only take the hadith literally, and until today, they will prevent their wives, their mothers, their sisters from travelling, even if it's a 1-hour plane journey, to see their parents who are in another state. Okay, they'll say no. Trust me, I've been through this. I know how annoying this is. But they're not flexible on any rulings whatsoever. And they reject fiqh because in many cases it works in their favour to be like this. And this is where Islam is used and abused so much. Because they can control people by using the literal understanding of a hadith. And this is why many of these Salafis hate the fuqaha. They hate Mufti Mink. They hate Umar Sulaiman. They hate everyone who applies fiqh to hadiths to make people's lives easier and to get them out of the controlling grip of people who use the literal understanding of hadiths to use and abuse and torment women especially. So the fuqaha are more flexible with the people and they find ways to apply Islamic rulings to your situation, especially if you have special circumstances. Okay, they will use authentic hadith to find a ruling for you in the 21st century. But these Salafis who follow the muhaddithin, they are very staunch in their following of hadith, and it can make life very difficult, and actually it's led to a lot of divorces. Because believe me when I tell you, it is unbearable living with someone with this mindset. They need to find some time machine and teleport themselves back to 7th century Arabia, because they can't expect everyone to have this mindset when it comes to living as Muslims in the 21st century. So the fuqaha made it easier for people, and they told women that as long as you have the permission of your guardian and you're going for something good, right, you're going to visit family or you've got a work conference or something important, you're not going to have a beach holiday with your friends and you're leaving your family behind. There are some things that are reasonable and things that aren't. Then it's okay for you to be traveling without your mahram, because this mahram has the responsibility of making sure that you are safe from A to Z. For example, he drives you to the airport and then he goes in with you to make sure that you get through security okay. Then he texts you to make sure you got on the plane okay. He texts you to make sure that you got off the plane okay. And he arranges for someone to pick you up at the airport. Okay, your friends, your family members, whoever it is, he has to make sure that you are taken care of. So he checks in on you to make sure you got to your destination okay. I mean, how hard can it be? And how likely is it that you're going to get ambushed by Bedouins on the way, right? The worst thing that could happen if you travel without a mahram these days is to forget your passport, right? That's the most inconvenient thing that could happen when you travel on your own. But if you get sick, there are medics available in the airport and in train stations to help you. And even if you get lost, there are people who can guide you to the right gate. They can show you which plane to get on. Okay, it's not a crisis anymore. Back in 7th century Arabia, it was a huge worry because they couldn't check in with their women who were travelling. They couldn't text them and ask them, are you okay? Did you get there okay? They had to wait for hours and days to hear back from people who had travelled because there was no form of communication that was instant like ours. They had to wait for someone to come back from that destination and inform them that their loved ones had reached there safely. So you can see why fiqh is important, and I use this as an example because people are still debating this today. Now the muhaddithin, the people who took the hadiths literally were beneficial for the four imams. So the four schools of thought were created from the authentic hadiths that were collected by the muhaddithin. Okay, so the authentic hadiths were needed to create the right fatwas. So examples of muhaddithin are Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim al-Hajjaj. So someone else asked, what is the difference between the four schools of thought? And the main differences are their opinions of what some hadiths meant because of the complexity of the Arabic language and grammar. Okay, not everyone could understand it properly. And they also differed on what was considered to be an authentic hadith and a weak hadith. And that was based on their access to the Sahaba and people who knew the Sahaba. So because they lived in different parts of the world, they had different access to people, and they all agreed that a minimum of 5 Sahabi needed to be seen doing something that validated a hadith to make it authentic. And this is called hadith mutawatir. And I read somewhere else that there was a minimum of 10 Sahabi or Sahabiyat who needed to be seen doing something to validate authentic hadith. And if they couldn't find enough Sahabi to validate the hadith, then it would be considered a weak hadith. Now, because of the Arabic language, it was possible for a hadith to have different meanings because of the grammar. And sometimes the meaning would change because of the language, or where certain words were placed that made the hadith confusing for them to understand. So for example, let's look at this in English. I saw a post the other day that said, "This car seats 6 people with no problems." So the original intention of the post is to say that the car is spacious enough to seat 6 people comfortably. But someone else can read it as, "This car will only seat 6 people who have no problems." So the absence of grammar has caused the post to have 2 different meanings. And this is what happened with a lot of hadiths. So scholars differed on what some hadiths meant. And sometimes the scholars were wrong. And it was their students who corrected them. Okay, sometimes their students were more affluent in the Arabic language. Sometimes they had a background in something else like astrology, biology, science, and they were able to make sense of a hadith because of their extra knowledge in other subjects. So the 4 imams were very humble in the sense that they were okay with being corrected by their students who knew better in some matters. And unfortunately, there are so many modern day scholars who don't have that humility. They get offended when anyone tries to correct them, when actually it's good for them to be corrected on something that they made a mistake in. But arrogance takes over a lot of people who have knowledge, and they refuse to be corrected because they find it damaging to their ego. I mean, even Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu was corrected by a woman once when he made a mistake when he was giving a khutbah about the dowry. So a group of men approached him to complain that women's dowries were too high for marriage, and they wanted him to address it and put a limit on it. So he agreed, and one day in a khutbah, he announced that the dowry will be capped, so it's affordable for everyone. And he told women to not be excessive in the dowry. Abd al-Rahman al-Sulami radiallahu anhu reported that Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu said, "لا تغالوا في مهور النساء." فقالت امرأة: ليس ذلك لك يا عمر، إن الله يقول وأتيتم إحداهن قنطار. فقال عمر: إن امرأة خاصمت عمر فخصمته. Do not be excessive in the dowry of women. A woman stood up and said, "It is not so, O Umar. For Allah said in Surah An-Nisa, verse 20, you gave one of them a great amount in dowry." And Umar replied with, "Indeed, a woman has disputed Umar and she has defeated him." And in another narration, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu said, the woman is right and Umar is wrong. So historians who studied the Islamic Golden Age said that a qintar means a large quantity of gold or silver. So some women back then wanted that as dowry and men couldn't afford it. But in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has left the dowry amount open. And in Hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said to keep the dowry reasonable so that women can marry good men. Because if the good men can't afford the dowries, then everyone misses out. Right? Society misses out, children miss out on having great fathers and so on. So it's for the greater good, but Allah kept it open because He knows that the wealthy women will have higher financial requirements than those who aren't wealthy. Now let's visit another hadith about the dowry, where Sahal ibn Sa'ad radiallahu anhu reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, تزوج ولو بخاتم من حديد. Marry even with a dowry equal to an iron ring. So this hadith was directed at those who were very poor, okay, and they didn't have many valuables. So if the most valuable thing they owned was an iron ring, then that's what they need to give as dowry, because dowry has to be something of value. So again, let's go back to Surah An-Nisa, verse 20. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنْ أَرَدْتُمُ اسْتِبْدَالَ زَوْجٍ مَكَانَ زَوْجٍ وَأَتَيْتُمْ إِحْدَاهُنَّ قِنْطَارًا فَلَا تَأْخُذُوا مِنْهُ شَيْئًا أَتَأْخُذُونَهُ بُهْتَانًا وَإِثْمًا مُبِينًا. If you desire to replace a wife with another, and you have given the former wife a stack of gold as dowry, do not take any of it back. Would you take it unjustly and very sinfully? So this is the Quran verse the woman quoted when she disputed Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, because here it's clear that a man can give whatever he wants and whatever he can afford, and a woman can ask for whatever she wants. However, the Salafis who follow the Muhaddithin only will say and guilt trip people into accepting an iron ring or something equivalent to an iron ring, even when they can afford a lot more as dowry. So again, they take the hadith literally, and they say, well, this hadith says, marry even with an iron ring. They don't look at the Quran verse, they look at what's easier, and they take that literally, and then they apply it to their lives, and they teach their women that this is the correct way of following the Sunnah. Even though there's evidence here that clearly shows that the hadith is directed towards those who are poor, not those who are able to afford a good dowry. I mean, even the Prophet ﷺ paid a lot more than an iron ring in dowry for all his wives. And even with Khadija radiallahu anha, there are narrations that state that he gave her beautiful camels and gold as dowry. So there will be many people out there who will choose to not apply fiqh to their situation so they can get away with doing the absolute bare minimum, even though the hadith is not addressed to them. It's addressed to other types of men. And a lot of men are also using this hadith as an example to justify being broke. And there's a big difference between being poor and being broke. So the poor man is someone who still has a job. Right, he's going out, he's working, he's earning money, but his rizq is limited. So he lives in poverty, okay? And the broke man is the one who has no money because he's lazy. He's not working, he's in and out of jobs, he just can't be bothered. Those are the broke men. And there are lots of broke men who want to get married. But what did the Prophet ﷺ say to them? He said, يا معشر الشباب من استطاع منكم الباءة فليتزوج فإنه أغض للبصر وأحصن للفرج ومن لم يستطع فعليه بالصوم فإنه له وجاء. O young men, if you are able to financially support a wife, then get married. Verily it lowers the gaze and guards your chastity. Whoever is not able to do so must fast, as it will restrain his sexual desires. And this has been reported by Bukhari and Muslim. So the Prophet ﷺ said that a poor man is not prevented from marriage because of his financial situation. he can just go and marry a poor woman from his community because they live the same lifestyle. It doesn't stop him. However, the broke man cannot get married because he's got no job and he's lazy and he's not pulling his weight. And on the contrary, he's looking for a woman who can fund him. These are the man children. Okay, they're so broke and lazy, they're looking for a woman who has money. And they say, well, the Prophet ﷺ married a wealthy woman, so we can as well. Oh, that's another story for another day. Because unfortunately, it's been so distorted in its meaning that it's justified the ill intentions of man children today who look for older, wealthier women to marry. And if they don't do that, then they will guilt trip women into accepting very petty, cheap dowry because of the hadith about the iron ring. So they will gaslight and manipulate women into accepting that for their own benefit. And this is why revert women are the biggest target for lots of these men, because they take advantage of their naivety in these matters. Okay? So there's another group of Salafis who follow the muhaddithin, and they also apply fiqh, and they belong to the Hanbali school of thought. So the Hanbali school of thought is the most conservative and the most strict in its understanding of the Quran and Sunnah of the four schools. So the fiqh is based on the literal meanings of the Quran and Hadith, so it's not as flexible as the other three schools. And many of these Salafis reject the fiqh from the Maliki, Shafi'i and Hanafi schools of thought. The Islamic education in Saudi is based on the Hanbali school of thought. And it's the school of thought I was raised with, and also the school of thought that I studied when I was at Mecca University. So I studied the other three as well, but particular emphasis was placed on this one. And there are many Muslims who don't like the Hanbali school of thought because of how rigid it can be in comparison to the others. Some people find it too strict, and so they prefer to belong to communities where it's easier to practice Islam. So for example, in the Hanbali school of thought, women have to wear niqab. And it doesn't matter where they live. They could live on the moon. They would still have to wear a niqab. However, in the Maliki school of thought, it's not an obligation. And again, both schools of thought are correct in this because it depends on what the Sahabiyat were seen doing. Some of the Sahabiyat were seen wearing the niqab all the time, and some were not seen wearing the niqab. And the same thing applies on their differences in opinion on other matters such as milk siblings. Okay, so as Shafi'i said that if a woman wants to breastfeed another baby who's not hers, and she wants him or her to be a milk sibling to her own children, then she has to breastfeed the baby at least 5 times. But Al-Malki said that breastfeeding a baby once is enough for him or her to be a milk sibling to your children. So if you breastfeed someone else's baby, such as your friend's baby, she might have had a baby at the same time, she may not have enough milk, and you offer to breastfeed her baby too, then if she has a boy and you have a girl, they can't get married when they're older. Okay, so he will become a mahram to her. And again, this will be based on what the Sahabiyat were seen doing. So the people who were reporting back to a Shafi'i were telling him that they saw women do it 5 times. And the people who reported back to Imam Malik told him that once was enough. Either way, their opinions are correct because they base them on the correct methodology to ensure that the hadith is authenticated and taken from muhaddithin. So ultimately, it's the job of the fuqaha to make ijtihad, make their own efforts to make the best sense they can of Islamic rulings and implement them correctly in every generation. Okay, so I'll give you another example of why fiqh is so important. In 7th century Arabia, did they have IVF treatments? No, they didn't. If people couldn't get pregnant, that was it. Khalas, they submitted to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And sometimes they resorted to herbal treatments. Okay, they would make their own herbal mixes and things to drink and eat to increase fertility and so on. But they didn't have advanced scientific methods in medicine to help them conceive. So when someone goes to ask for a fiqh ruling on IVF, the mufti might say it's forbidden. Okay, if it's not done in a natural way, it's forbidden. And another mufti might say that it's okay to accept the medical treatments that are offered to you today to conceive. However, it has to be done within the guidelines of what is taught to us in the Quran and Sunnah. So, for example, you cannot be impregnated by the sperm of a man who is not your mahram. So going to sperm banks is forbidden. And if you are someone who has frozen your eggs or frozen your sperm, then they can only be put together if you are still married. Okay, so you can't impregnate yourself with your ex-husband's sperm because, again, there are Islamic rulings in place for the rights of the children and, all the problems that could be created if you were to have your ex-husband's child a year after the divorce or 2 years after the divorce. You're creating so many social issues for yourself and personal issues that can be avoided. So if you were to go for IVF, then the impregnation has to happen while you're still married. And honestly, I don't know what level of insanity someone has to reach to impregnate themselves with their ex-husband's sperm. But because these are frozen, sometimes women get desperate. And when they're desperate for a child, they can do crazy things. And sometimes believe that impregnating themselves with their ex-husband's sperm will be easier than being childless, or maybe they want another sibling for their children, and so on. Right? Some people have crazy thoughts and ideas, and these are questions that have been asked. And it's also mustahab, so it's preferred that in any medical treatment for women that the doctor is a female. But it's not an obligation because the fuqaha know that sometimes the only doctors available for a medical treatment are men. So you have to look at the original rulings to see the validity of these Islamic rulings of fiqh. Okay? Now, the Salafi scholars and people who follow the muhaddithin only do not accept new scholarship. So they believe that the understanding of the Quran and Sunnah has been completed already. But this isn't possible because in every generation we have new research that appears, we have new science, we have new technology, we have new social problems, and they all need fiqh to be applied to them. And new knowledge will appear until the Day of Judgment. Okay, until the Day of Judgment, the Quran and Hadith will have new interpretations. Because there are Quran verses about the sights that are to be seen in the Day of Judgment that will only make sense to those who see them firsthand. And perhaps the letters Alif, Lam, Mim in Surah Al-Baqarah are a code for something that people in 2040 will understand. Okay, we don't understand it, but it's meant for people in that time to understand it. So parts of the Quran will be revealed to people in the future until the Day of Judgment. So for example, in Surah Al-Mu'minun, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes to us how a fetus is created in the womb of his or her mother. Now back then they didn't have the technology or the science to understand this properly, or visualize it, or see what happens in the womb. They didn't have scanners or anything. So imagine reading this. Okay, it's ayah 12 to 14. وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ. And indeed we created humankind from an extract of clay. ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاهُ نُطْفَةً فِي قَرَارٍ مَكِينٍ. Then we placed each human as a sperm drop in a secure place. ثم خلقنا النطفة علقة فخلقنا العلقة مضغة فخلقنا المضغة عظاما فكسونا العظام لحما ثم أنشأناه خلقا آخر فتبارك الله أحسن الخالقين. Then we developed the drop into a clinging clot. Then we developed the clot into a lump of flesh. Then we developed the lump into bones. And then we clothed the bones with flesh. Then we brought it into being as a new creation. So blessed is Allah, the best of creators. So imagine reading that back then and having no idea what that means at all. It's something that you can't even visualize. You're just thinking of lumps of flesh, right? You can't think of what a fetus looks like, the head that's forming, the eyes that are forming, the arms, the feet, the legs. It's difficult to imagine that, but we can imagine that now when we read Quran because we've seen scans. We've seen programs about how babies are conceived, how they grow in the womb, how they're born. We have so much information about that now. So nothing is left to imagination anymore. So we're blessed to have this technology and this knowledge. So this is evidence again that the Quran cannot be interpreted literally. It has to be interpreted with other knowledge from other subjects, such as science, technology, biology, physics, astrology, even mathematics. Go on YouTube and type in the mathematical miracles of the Quran. Your mind will be blown. And you even get some engineering tips in the Quran, such as the materials that Dhul Qarnayn used to build the wall to protect the people from Juj and Majuj. And you also have knowledge from people who have spiritual insight, who can explain to you the world of the jinn, like Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. Okay, so it's really important to not be rigid in your understanding of the Quran and Hadith, because it's always open to new interpretation, because every year new meaning is added to it, and that's why we have so many conversions to Islam now. People are starting to connect modern knowledge with the information provided for us in the Quran. And this is evidence to them that everything that's written in the Quran is the truth. So to wrap this up, I would say that the safest thing to do would be to prioritize the literal meanings of the Quran and understand the context of those hadiths and Quran verses, and then apply fiqh when needed. So for example, if you can travel with your mahram, your husband, your father, your brother, then it's best to do so. Okay, try and limit the number of times you travel without them. And that's just for you to be on the safe side. And if it's not possible, if it's unavoidable, then apply fiqh. So if they can't go with you, but you need to travel for something urgent, then fiqh can be applied here. But as long as you make all efforts to stay on the safe side, then you'll be fine, inshallah. And this is why I tell so many people that it's so important for you to marry someone who has the same understanding of Islam as you do. So if they follow a different school of thought, you might clash in opinions on fiqh. If you marry someone who only follows muhaddithin and you are from the Maliki school of thought, it will never work. Okay, that marriage will never work out. So it's preferable for you to marry someone who follows the same school of thought, just to make your lives easier. Because nobody's got time to be fighting over fiqh every single day. It's exhausting, it's torture, and it will kill you. Believe me, you'll be fighting over so many things. He'll be screaming at you to not listen to Mufti Mink. You'll be annoyed at all the staunch, sheikhs that he's listening to, that he's forcing you to listen to as well. And you'll have different opinions on everything. And he will believe that he's in the right. You'll believe that you're in the right. And it's just not worth it. Honestly, it's not worth it. So if you both have different understandings of Islamic rulings, then it's best that you just leave it. Otherwise, you'll end up being forced into a lifestyle you didn't sign up for. Now, the next question is, in the Sufi mosque I go to, people pray with their arms by their sides, but others pray with their hands by their chests. Why do these Muslims pray differently to others? So this is an issue that highlights the problematic practice of people blindly following what they see instead of researching what they should be doing. Okay, so there's a story behind why some Sufis pray with their arms by their sides, and it's not because this is taken as a practice from the Prophet ﷺ in the way he prayed. No, there's a story behind why people copied Imam Malik rahimahullah when he did this. because all four schools of thought agreed that when you pray, your hands are to be held by your chest, because this is the way the Prophet ﷺ prayed. So during the time of Imam Malik, rahimahullah, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur became the Khalifa, and he took a bay'ah from the people. But due to the political grievances and rebellions, the authorities added a condition that if you rebelled against the government or broke your allegiance to the Khalifa, your wives would be divorced and your slaves would be set free. So Imam Malik rahimahullah narrated a hadith that he knew to be authentic, and that was that forced divorces are not accepted as divorces. So it's forbidden to force anyone to divorce their husband or wife. So he was informing the people who had divorced their wives that they were still Islamically married. So when Ja'far ibn Sulaiman, the cousin of the Khalifa, heard that Imam Malik stated this condition means nothing, he ordered Imam Malik to not narrate this hadith to the people anymore, and this was due to politics. And he sent a man to the Imam's class one day and had him ask the question as a test. So the man asked him, is a divorce valid under force? And the Imam related his opinion and narrated the hadith, and in the face of danger he spoke the truth. So back then there were huge consequences for, standing against the Khalifa or standing up for justice and the truth. So unfortunately, the Khalifa heard about this and he had him flogged in public, in front of everyone. And subhanAllah, while he was being flogged, he called out and said, whoever knows me knows me. Whoever does not, I am Malik, the son of Anas, and I believe the divorce of the one under force doesn't happen. And they increased his flogging until he could not pray with his hands in front of him. So he continued to lead the prayer after that, but people started to see him pray with his arms by his sides because he was in so much pain he couldn't lift them. So it said the ignorant among the people just copied him, despite him saying that the correct way to pray is to have your hands by your chest, and some people did it out of honor for him. So they wanted to show their love and loyalty and compassion by praying in the way he does, but he didn't agree with this. He said, despite what I go through, you must follow the correct Sunnah. Right? You must do what the Prophet ﷺ taught you to do. So that's why a lot of Sufis until today pray with their arms by their sides, but it's the wrong way to pray. It's incorrect. This is out of ignorance that they're doing it. So if you're ever confused about an Islamic ruling, check what the other schools of thought have said about the subject. And what the majority have agreed on will be the correct ruling. I love the story of Imam Malik rahimahullah because his life was a testament to, that unshakable strength, subhanAllah, that emerges from holding so tightly to the truth and to your beliefs. He was known for his knowledge and his piety, and he clashed a lot with the authorities over sensitive legal issues. So they tried to silence him, and until today, we are benefiting from his knowledge. So, he faced so much pressure to compromise on his beliefs, but his steadfastness in the face of all this pressure is a testimony of his sincere love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? That's how you know someone really does love Allah, when they hold on to that truth. His life teaches us that true strength comes from holding on to your values and your principles and your beliefs, and that those who do that will always win at the end. Okay, with patience and hardships comes a lot of reward. And I mentioned it in my previous podcast, the true scholars were always ready to be martyred for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for the sake of upholding the truth. So if you get a chance, do read his biography. It's really interesting. And he compiled the book called Al-Muwatta. So that's where you can see where he got his fiqh rulings from. And if you follow a madhab, it's best to stick to the Islamic rulings of that madhab, because like I said, there will be differences in opinion. And if the community is following the madhab, then it's easier for everyone to be in agreement with the rulings of that madhab when it comes to marriage, divorce, burials, and so on. So it's not good for you to be cherry picking from other schools of fiqh if you belong to a community that follows one madhab. So unless you get really stuck on getting a fatwa in your school of thought for a particular situation, then it's okay for you to go to another school to see if you can get an answer there for what you're meant to be doing. So the next question is, you said that scholars are the trustees of Allah over His creation. So does that mean the leaders have to obey the scholars too? First of all, that's not what I said. That's a Sahih Hadith. Okay? And yes, it's clear that all leaders who are Muslim have to obey the Muslim scholars, especially when it comes to halal and haram. So if a leader wants to do something and it goes against the Sharia, then the scholars have the right to stop them or at least call them out on it, just like Imam Malik did, rahimahullah. So in Islam, the leaders have to consult the scholars before they make any social or political moves. And this is to ensure that everything they do is in line with Islamic law. And if they ignore the advice of the scholars, then the scholars have to make it publicly known that the leader is doing something wrong. And this is to protect the people from being misguided and falling into shirk. The next question is, can you give us examples of problematic rulings and fatwas? So these examples are based on my own opinion as a result of all the negative consequences that came from them after they were implemented in society. So like I said before, all the scholars made mistakes. Okay, especially the modern day ones, they will make more mistakes than the previous ones did. Now, all scholars have to be respected, but it doesn't mean that you have to agree with every fatwa they release. So here are a few examples that were released by Al-Uthaymeen, Al-Fawzan, Bin Baz, and so on, that I personally found to be problematic because of what happened in society after. So the first one is secret marriages. Okay, we know in Islam that a man doesn't have to have his wife's permission to have another wife, but he needs to consult her because it will affect her. So him having a secret wife goes against the principles of Islam because he's going to be sneaking around and he'll be lying to her about where he's going. And if anything happened to him, no one knows about the secret wife and any children he might have from her. So if he dies, for example, no one knows that she's owed inheritance rights. No one knows that the children of the first wife have siblings from the second wife. And it causes a mess. And she needs to be consulted about him wanting to take a second wife because it's going to affect her. He has to split his time. He's got to split his energy and his finances. So of course it's going to affect the first wife. Taking a second wife in secret will cause more problems. But some of these scholars said that it's a man's right to get married in secret because he's allowed up to 4. But schools of thought have said that it's not the right of every Muslim man to have 4 wives. Allah has only made it permissible for certain types of men in special circumstances. Okay, so it's not the right of every Muslim man because not every Muslim man can do it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran that the majority of you will be unable to pull it off. So it can't be a right of every Muslim man. But these scholars said that it was. And they encouraged all Muslim men to have up to 4 wives. And if they couldn't afford it and they were married to one and that wife had money, she is obligated in Islam to help him have 4. And if she does that, then she will be considered to be a righteous wife. There was a woman who called Al-Uthaymeen to ask him, will I be considered sinful if I'm unable to accept my husband having a second wife? I can't take it. I want a divorce. And he told her she will be very sinful and Allah will not forgive it. This is wrong because it's not an obligation for him to have 4 wives. So if she can't handle it, if it's something she really can't accept, then she's allowed to get a divorce with that reason. But these scholars didn't accept it. So if a Muslim woman went to ask for a khula in a court, using that as the reason, they would deny her the khula. They wouldn't allow her to have the divorce. They would say that she is athima, that she is sinful, and that she needs to fear Allah and go back home. So women were at the mercy of men who decided whether their reasons for divorce were valid or not valid, even though the Prophet ﷺ accepted the khula of Jamila, the wife of Thabit radiallahu anhu, on the basis that she wasn't attracted to him. The Prophet ﷺ understood that if she wasn't attracted to him, then she wouldn't be able to fulfill his rights to intimacy. So he allowed the divorce to go ahead in return for Thabit's dowry, which was a garden. The Prophet ﷺ did not guilt trip her, or tell her that she is sinful, or tell her that Allah is not pleased with her. And he certainly did not tell her that she is now the cause of Allah's throne shaking because of the divorce that she's requested, which is a fabricated hadith, by the way. The hadith that states that Allah's throne shakes because of divorce is fabricated, and this was verified by Shaykh Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah. And it was fabricated to manipulate people, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the right to divorce if the marriage isn't working out. It's not a sin to divorce. It is a sin to divorce when you're doing it unjustly, but if you have good reasons to not want to stay in a marriage, then there's nothing wrong with that at all. But scholars did use this hadith to scare people into staying together, and what happened is that it fueled the continuation of toxic marriages. And people were guilt-tripped, especially women, to stay with abusers. And they were always taught to fear Allah when they went to apply for a khula. And when they did go to apply for a khula, the scholars and judges would make it very difficult. I'm talking about Saudi here. Okay, the Salafi scholars who either only followed the muhaddithin or who were strict Hanbalis. A lot of women, when they used to go to apply for a khula, alhamdulillah, this system has been abolished now. But before, when a woman went to court, sometimes a khula would take years to get. And it would be a very expensive process, because the scholars and judges used to say that based on a Quran verse, a woman has to ransom herself out of the marriage, and they left the amount open for the man to stipulate. So if a man says, I want 1,000,000 riyals, that's what she has to pay. And if she can't pay it, there's no divorce. Even if she says she's being beaten, even if she has evidence that he's a drug addict, even if she has evidence that he's a criminal, they don't care. You want the divorce, ransom yourself. He's asked for 1,000,000, bring the 1,000,000. And these are people who used to call themselves strict Salafis. And this is why so much hatred for Islam brewed in Saudi, because women were really oppressed in this system. So she had to borrow from banks. She has to borrow from family. People would come together to help her get out of this marriage that was highly toxic. And if she couldn't, she was stuck. She had to stay in that marriage because she couldn't pay the ransom. So if you go to Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah 229, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا يُقِيمَا حُدُودَ اللَّهِ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْهِمَا فِيمَا افْتَدَتْ بِهِ تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا وَمَنْ يَتَعَدَّ حُدُودَ اللَّهِ فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. So if you fear that a couple will not be able to keep within the limits of Allah, there is no blame if the wife compensates the husband to obtain a divorce. These are the limits set by Allah, so do not transgress them. And whoever transgresses the limits of Allah, they are the true wrongdoers. So the Salafi scholars agreed that there is no harm in the husband seeking more than the dowry he gave his wife at the time of marriage. So they understood from this verse that there is no limit set for the compensation. So the word fidya is left unrestricted. So this understanding, which is literal, is used by the scholars to say that the compensation can be greater than the value of the dowry. And this is incorrect. And we know that it's incorrect because of the story of Jamila and her husband Thabit radiallahu anhu, when the Prophet ﷺ only asked Thabit to take back his dowry and nothing more in return for her khula. Okay, so the other schools of thought agree with this, but the literalist Salafis did not. And that's why in Saudi courts, the khula cases were the most complicated and they were the most depressing to witness because men took advantage of asking for whatever compensation they wanted. Sometimes they asked for ridiculous amounts that they know the woman can't pay just to keep her stuck in an abusive marriage, and the judge says, okay, no problem, you can't pay it, that's what he's asked for. Wallahi, I saw it with my own eyes. I've worked in the Saudi court. I went and I did a lot of research there and I saw horrific cases. This was back in the day before Mohammed bin Salman changed the court system. So now a woman can easily obtain a khula by returning the dowry that the husband originally gave her and nothing else. So this is now a standard procedure across the board. And she doesn't even have to provide a valid reason that they approve anymore. It's now enough that she hates him. And you can imagine how many abusive men hate this system. But it was done as a part of the new feminist movement to help women obtain their rights from abusive men. Because it was absolutely unacceptable for a woman to spend 12 years trying to obtain a khula. I know a woman who was married to a judge, and because of his connections in court, she was never granted a khula. So all the judges in the court would work together to protect their friend's ego, because in the Arabian Gulf, I said it in a previous podcast, it was embarrassing as hell to be divorced by your wife. So she would always go to the court. He refused to divorce her because he wanted to keep her hanging. He was an abuser. And he wouldn't give her a khula. So she would go to other judges in the court and they'd all deny the khula. For 12 years they denied it because of their friend. And this is what happens when narcissists work together. And bear in mind that during these 12 years, she was living separately because he had a second wife. And she would have been okay with that if he wasn't oppressive in regards to his authority over her. So again, back then, there were fatwas that were released that stated that a woman couldn't do anything without the permission of her husband. She couldn't even have an operation, even if she was in urgent need of one, without the permission of her husband. Now we know that it's an Islamic requirement for every wife to obey her husband, but that's also within reason. The Salafi scholars didn't state within reason. They stated that anything the husband asks you to do or stops you from doing, you must obey. If he doesn't want you to ever leave the house at all, you must obey. If he doesn't want you to dress a certain way in the home or to meet with your family and have a nice time with them, you have to obey. So life became unbearable for women because men took full advantage of this. Okay, this is why we have huge rebellion right now in Saudi, because women are so happy to be freed from the clutches of narcissistic abusers who took advantage of every teeny tiny fatwa that was given by these scholars in regards to these matters of control. And some men were really petty with their requirements and their demands for obedience. And it was because they just enjoyed the control. They enjoyed the authority. The Prophet ﷺ said this, but only a smart man, a mature man, will know that he has to be wise with what he, asks obedience for. Because if he's going to demand permission for every tiny thing and obedience for every tiny thing, his wife's going to hate him. What's he going to gain from that? Nothing. But narcissistic men, as you know, don't care. They don't care if they live with women who hate their guts. The more the women hate them, the more entertaining it is for them, because they revel in seeing people suffer. And men in general who objectify women and don't take their feelings into consideration are narcissists. No one wants to be trapped in a cage. If you put an animal in a cage, it will rebel. So if you become too stifling and suffocating in your demands for obedience, you're going to lose your wife. she is going to lose all her feelings for you. Now, going back to the story of the woman I told you about who was fighting for a khula for 12 years, she was a professor in a university. She was a professor in the Islamic Studies department in Riyadh. And he stopped her working. He would give her peanuts and allowance every month. He knew how much she loved her job, but he didn't give her permission to continue. And he did it on purpose, so that she would be humiliated. Okay, she was earning a lot of money in her position as a lecturer, but he wanted to give her the peanuts to show her how low her station is with him. Like, you think you're better than me? You're a lecturer, you're this, you're that. Nope. I demand that you stay at home. You have to obey me. If you go to any court, the judges will tell you that your husband is in the right. You must obey. And it was all out of jealousy. So he knew that she had great potential. She was one of the best professors in Riyadh. And he stopped her from working. And this was during the time when women didn't have a voice. They couldn't stand up for themselves in court. And the new system that Mohammed bin Salman brought into the kingdom changed everything. And this is why Saudi women love Mohammed bin Salman so much. You can't say a negative word about him to any Saudi woman. They will shoot you if you do. Because he freed them from this oppressive system. And now, unfortunately, it's gone the other way. Because one type of extremism often breeds another type. And we can now see an increase in liberalism and the number of atheists in the Arabian Gulf, because they hated the strict Islamic system that was forced upon them. It gave them so many traumas. It gave them a horrible understanding of what Islam is. So now you don't need your husband's permission to drive, get a license, to study, to travel, to work, because of how much men abused their authority. And this came as a result of fatwas that didn't have limits on how much a man could control his wife and so on. So it was left open for men to do as they please. And yes, you get men who are so petty, they will get upset if you don't ask them for permission to call your dad. Or, you didn't get my permission to eat that cheese sandwich, or you didn't get my permission to wear that dress today. It's ridiculous. There's a level of pettiness in narcissistic men that can drive you insane. Okay, there's a whole podcast about this. It's number 67 if you're interested in listening to more about this subject. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, يا أيها الناس إياكم الغلو في الدين فإنه أهلك من كان قبلكم الغلو في الدين. O people, beware of extremism and exaggeration in religion, for those who came before you were ruined by extremism in religion. So this is a Sahih Hadith about the nations that were destroyed by religious extremism. And this is what happened to Saudi. Okay, so it's turning into a secular country now because of the extremism in fatwas, the extremism in the laws. Everything was so strict and so suffocating that it caused people to rebel. And a Muslim country is now being destroyed Islamically because of it. So it's a satanic mission if you think about it. Because religious extremism can make people's lives very difficult. And it can also cause oppression when the correct Islamic ruling of fiqh is not applied to the right situations. So for example, a woman should not have spent 12 years obtaining a khula. This is oppression. And a judge should have issued a fasq despite the feelings of his friend, who was her husband. So when a woman is left hanging in a marriage, the right fiqh to apply here is that she gets an immediate fasq, an immediate termination of the marriage by another judge. Because it's forbidden in Islam to keep a woman hanging like this. But he only did it to stop her from living her life, because he knew that she would need his permission for everything. So the longer he can keep her hanging, the more she's going to get delayed in her progression with her career and in her life in general, and she won't be able to remarry either. And these are the preachers and imams and scholars and judges who are demons in religious clothing. Okay, not everyone who has a beard and, who has a subha in his hand and who, prays 5 times a day and all of that is a God-fearing person. I've seen hundreds of people like this, hundreds. And it's important that they are known because these are the people who are driving people out of Islam, which makes it incredibly ironic. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ الدِّينَ يُسْرٌ وَلَنْ يُشَادَّ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَهُ فَسَدِّدُوا وَقَارِبُوا وَأَبْشِرُوا وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالْغَدْوَةِ وَالرَّوْحَةِ وَشَيْءٍ مِنَ الدُّلْجَةِ. Religion is very easy, and whoever overburdens himself in his religion will not be able to continue in that way. So you should not be extremists, but try to be near to perfection and receive the good tidings that you will be rewarded, and gain strength by worshipping in the mornings, the afternoons, and during the last hours of the nights. This is narrated in Sahih al-Bukhari. So being overly strict in Islam will only give you a hard heart and depression, because even you will suffer and your life will become difficult as well. And the most miserable Muslims I have ever met are those who are super strict. And they're also the most judgmental of other people. I find it mind-boggling when I see women who support the super strict understanding of Islam that many men have. I'll never understand it. It's almost like they love being tortured in that way, when even the Prophet ﷺ was more flexible than these men were with his wives. And they get angry at other women who don't agree with their way of life and who don't become the wives that they are to their own husbands. They get angry with that and they're like, well, you're a terrible wife, we are more deserving of Jannah, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, it's because other people have a better understanding of Islam than you do. And they are following the Prophet ﷺ's advice to be moderate in their practicing of Islam. Being overly strict pushes people away from the deen and pushes people away from those types of people because they make life so difficult with their expectations of others. They expect everyone around them to be like them. And if they're not, then they're not good Muslims. And they might even be branded as kafirs if they really push it that far. And this is haram, as you know. You can't call any Muslims kafirs or disbelievers out of your own opinion. So if Islam is not easy for you to practice, bearing in mind that you are conforming to everything that's halal and haram, then you are following a more difficult understanding of the deen. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Taha, verse 2, مَا أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْقُرْآنَ لِتَشْقَى. We have not revealed the Qur'an to you, O Prophet, to cause you any distress. So the Qur'an is meant to make your life better. It's meant to give you a good quality of life. It's not there to make your life hard. It's not been revealed for you to read so that your life is difficult and miserable and all of that. The guidelines we are given, they are for protection. And it's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves us that He gives us this Qur'an as a guide for halal and haram. So it all depends on how you view the Qur'an, how your perception is of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how much you intend to enjoy Islam as a way of life. Okay, there's a new Qur'an translation that's come out recently. It's called the Majestic Qur'an. It's got a beautiful blue cover. I recommend that people who don't know Arabic that well to read this, because the English language is easy to understand and it's great for reverts as well. I really enjoyed reading this one, and the interpretation of the verses is correct too. So it's really important that we enjoy reading the Quran and learning about the Hadith and all of these things, because it does strengthen our Iman. And it's also important to not lean towards one perception of Allah too much and leave the other. Okay, so yes, Allah is the most merciful, but we also have to take into account that Allah will also punish us for oppression and major sins. But His mercy overrides that when we repent. So if we repent from our major sins and our minor sins, then Allah is the most giving, the most merciful. And this balance is mentioned often in the Quran. So if you look in Surah Al-Ra'd, verse 6, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنَّ رَبَّكَ لَذُو مَغْفِرَةٍ لِلنَّاسِ عَلَى ظُلْمِهِمْ وَإِنَّ رَبَّكَ لَشَدِيدُ الْعِقَابِ. Surely your Lord is full of forgiveness for people despite their wrongdoing, and your Lord is also truly severe in punishment. And in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 98, اعلموا أن الله شديد العقاب وأن الله غفور رحيم. Know that Allah is severe in punishment and that He is also all-forgiving, most merciful. So don't be of the people who are like, I won't conform to the obligations in Islam because Allah's not going to throw me in hell for this and He's not going to punish me for that. He's so merciful, He's so loving, He loves me more than my parents. Yes, He does, but there's a reason why those rulings are in place. Okay, so don't be too lenient with Allah's love. Don't take that for granted, and don't dismiss what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked you to do because you want to believe in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you decide not to do those things. Okay, this is wrong. And don't burden yourself too much with the fear of Allah punishing you for every tiny little thing. So this is the opposite case, where everything you do, every mistake you make, you worry if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to curse you, punish you, throw you in hell for it. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted Fir'aun to repent in his last moments, do you think He's not going to have mercy for you? Of course He will. So when you repent from a sin, let it go. Stop dwelling on that sin. Stop coming back to it and punishing yourself for making that mistake. And asking yourself, did Allah forgive me? I'm not worthy of forgiveness. Allah doesn't love me. Allah hates me because I've done this and I've done that. No. Always remember that if Fir'aun had repented before the sea was split, Allah would have saved him from the hellfire. The hellfire is for the mushrikeen. It's not for the person who makes the average mistake every now and again. It's for people who are mushrikeen. All he had to say was La ilaha illallah, and he would have been saved from the hellfire. Allah wanted to save him from the hellfire, but his arrogance took over and he drowned being a disbeliever. So don't let your negative thoughts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala consume you, because it's your qareen who wants you to always think that way. And I know many of you have been traumatized by strict parents and Quran teachers and so on when you were younger, who punished you for every tiny mistake. But don't let those childhood traumas alter your perception of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and make you believe that you are deserving of punishment and hell for any mistakes that you end up repenting from anyway. Anas radiallahu anhu reported that he heard the Prophet alayhi salatu salam say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, so this is a hadith Qudsi, Ya ibn Adam, إنك ما دعوتني ورجوتني غفرت لك على ما كان منك ولا أبالي. يا ابن آدم لو بلغت ذنوبك عنان السماء ثم استغفرتني غفرت لك. يا ابن آدم إنك لو أتيتني بقراب الأرض خطايا ثم لقيتني لا تشرك بي شيئا لأتيتك بقرابها مغفرة. O son of Adam, so long as you call upon me and ask of me, I shall forgive you for what you have done, and I shall not mind. O son of Adam, were your sins to reach the clouds of the sky, and were you then to ask forgiveness of me, I would forgive you. O son of Adam, were you to come to me with sins nearly as great as the earth, and were you then to face me, ascribing no partner to me, I would bring you forgiveness nearly as great as it. So don't waste your lives wondering if Allah loves you, wondering if Allah is going to forgive you. You have this hadith. Okay, it's very clear. Just be regular in your repentance and you'll be fine, inshallah. In regards to the fatwas, I would advise you to always ask yourself if a fatwa will result in a bad consequence for you and the society and your family or not. If it will, leave that fatwa. Sometimes when scholars made mistakes and they were corrected later by other scholars, old fatwas were retracted. And until now, the narcissistic Muslims will use the fatwas that were retracted as evidence for abuse that they are putting people through and so on. So always check the validity of a fatwa when it's given to you or when you come across one. Because sometimes people will go with a fatwa that is no longer valid out of ignorance because they don't know that it's been retracted, or they play dumb. They know it's been retracted, but they still want to use it as a card to play when they want to get their way in something. So it's always advised to take your fatwas from scholars and muftis who have studied the 4 schools of thought, and not to take fatwas from regular people who don't have knowledge in these matters. And check if it's still valid. Especially when it sounds a bit dodgy to you. Okay, especially when there's something, for example, highly misogynistic about it, or it just generally feels off. Okay, always check it. The next question is, why do some Muslims really hate empathic scholars and call them kafirs? The simple answer is because they're narcissists. Okay, all narcissistic individuals will hate empathic people. And when it comes to empathic scholars, like I said before, some people who only follow the muhaddithin will not agree with scholars who belong to a madhab. So, for example, if a scholar is a follower of the Shafi'i madhab or the Maliki madhab, they believe that the interpretations of the Quran and Hadiths are wrong because they're not literal. So these scholars have created fatwas and different understandings of Islamic rulings to help people in their lives. Some people say that this is kufr, and that only the literal understanding of the Hadith or the Quran verse is to be taken. And that's why many of these men don't let their wives listen to Mufti Mink and Umar Sulaiman and so on, because they say that these are deviants, right? They're not following the true Islam, the true Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is ridiculous. Especially when these empathic scholars don't agree with the strict and harsh fatwas concerning women. So, they're more lenient and flexible and loving and kind towards women, unlike the staunch Salafis who are very harsh and difficult with women. So when they oppose the fatwas given to them by their scholars, there's a clash, and they start to believe that they are causing a fitna for them because their wives are listening to Mufti Mink, who has a different opinion about women and women's rights to the staunch Salafis, and it's causing a problem in their marriage. And that's why a lot of these men ban their women from listening to these empathic scholars, and they will only allow them to listen to their sheikhs and their preachers. And you'll always find that they're very misogynistic and very rigid in their understanding of the Quran and Hadith. And I did hear some people say that they think that Umar Sulaiman is a deviant because he supports LGBTQ and all of that, when he clearly said in a video that he's not supportive of this movement, but out of his own empathy, he recognizes these people as sinners and he's inviting them to Islam. What do they expect him to do? We live in a world where this has become rampant now. Okay, homosexuality is spreading in the ummah, and he needs to do something about it because he is a preacher. So he's going to call upon them in a kind manner. He's going to interact with them kindly. It doesn't mean he supports them. He did come out in a video and say that, he's just doing his job. He's not supporting the movement. He's just helping people to learn about Islam, repent from their sins, and get close to their Creator. This is what the Prophet ﷺ told us to do. If the Prophet ﷺ approached tyrants and oppressors in a kind manner, then of course we're going to approach every other sinner in a merciful way. But staunch Salafis can't stand this. They believe that, it's a harsh approach with everyone. You've got to get the sword out. You can't be nice and kind to sinners. It means that you're one of them, and that you are now someone who is, a disbeliever or a major sinner or a fasiq or a hypocrite or someone who is a secret enemy, against the ummah. They're plotting and planning to destroy the Muslims, and they're working undercover, and they come up with all these stupid conspiracies. What is this? This is why people don't like them, and why being married to them is really hard. If you are considering someone like this for marriage, good luck. If you are the same kind of person, you'll get on fine. But if you're not, you will suffer. Because they will deprive you from the company of anyone who is highly empathic, because their light irritates them. They will prefer that you listen to petty dawah bros who only care about follows and views and likes and their silly red pill content over the opinions and teachings of wise, mature scholars who are soft and calm in their approach. In Surah Al-Imran, verse 159, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُتَوَكِّلِينَ. It is out of Allah's mercy that you, O Prophet, have been lenient with them. Had you been cruel or hard-hearted, they would certainly have abandoned you. So pardon them, ask Allah's forgiveness for them, and consult with them in conducting manners. Once you make a decision, put your trust in Allah. Surely Allah loves those who trust in Him. So in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the Prophet ﷺ and reminds him and the believers of the favour that he has made his heart and words soft for his ummah, and the people who follow his command and refrain from what he prohibits. So this verse teaches us that if you want to give dawah to Muslims and non-Muslims, you have to be kind and soft in your approach. Abdullah ibn Amr radiallahu anhu said that the Prophet ﷺ was not severe, harsh or obscene when he dealt with evil or problematic people. And it was said that his calmness and his approach with people actually brought people to Islam because of the mercy he showed sinners and the disbelievers. The next question is, why do some imams and preachers enable the abuse of men towards their families? And I'd say here, the majority of them will be narcissists themselves. So if you were to go to an imam and present him with a case where your husband is physically abusing you and verbally abusing you, and you're telling the imam that you want a divorce, the imam might say to you, no, this is not a valid reason for divorce. What did you do? You must have done something to trigger all this anger and rage in him. It's because he's like that at home as well. Okay, when he gives the abuser an excuse, it's because he's like that. So if he was to hold the abuser accountable for what he's doing, and he allows the woman to get the divorce from the Sharia council or the mosque, then it's almost like he's holding himself accountable and he's running from that. So it's like he's applying the ruling to himself. So he knows that his wife is also entitled to a divorce because of how he treats her, but he's denying that he's the abuser. They don't like to look at themselves as abusers because they always want to play the victim. So when they get presented with cases like this, they're like, no, there's nothing wrong. This is normal. All men are like this. All men are grumpy. All men are cranky. They can shout and get abusive. This is what they're like. It's because he's like that. If he had a good character, he would say, yeah, this is not good. Bring the man. Let me speak to him because this is not good behavior. But if he encourages you to have patience or to fear Allah or to do better as a wife, and he gives you suggestions on how you can be a better wife, then know that he's like that with his own family. Because he would want a sheikh to say the same thing to his wife if she was to complain about him. And in general, narcissists, whether they're preachers or imams or whoever, if they see the person who is complaining is a high-level empath or an empathic codependent, they will want to punish you. They're not going to allow this empathic person to have their way and get justice. Oh no, they're all working together. These are all demonic entities working together, whether that's consciously or subconsciously. So they work with each other to make sure that the empath never wins in these cases. And that's why so many narcissists win court cases, and they win cases in the Sharia Council as well. Because if the judge is narcissistic, if lawyers are narcissistic, and so on, that's what's going to happen. Narcissists often do get their way in court. And justice is only given to the empaths from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You will see later in the lives of these narcissists who conned and scammed and manipulated and lied and deceived in court, you see them get their punishment later in life. Allah sends it to them in ways you can't imagine. So don't expect Sharia councils and courts and other organizations to give you justice as an empath. Most of the time your justice will come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I always tell people, just be accepting of the divine decree. If you don't get your justice in this life, you'll get it in the next. And narcissists will always be punished for everything they do in this life, whether you see it or not. Especially those who enable this abuse, like people in authority who are supposed to be protecting the interests of good people and the believers in general. There was a story a while back, and I'm talking like 15 to 16 years ago, in Saudi, of a sheikh who was divorced by his wife. So he was working in one of the big courts in Saudi, and he was so angry about it because another sheikh issued the fasq for her. So as a punishment for her obtaining a fasq from the court that was issued by a empathic judge who was quite, compassionate with her case, he took the children away, and some of them were quite young, and he would torture her by sending her recordings of him beating them, burning them with cigarette butts and so on. So she would always hear them screaming and crying, and he wouldn't let her see them. So she went to the judges about this, and because he was a sheikh in the court, they didn't know what to do. Because if they were to expose this case and what he was doing to the children, his reputation would be destroyed. So people started to cover up for him, and the mother was deprived from her children for a few years until she decided to go to the media about it. And there was a liberal Saudi who took her story to the press, and they exposed him. He was all over the news. It was a horrific case because he's one of those sheikhs who comes on TV and he would always preach about the rights of parents, the rights of the wife, the rights of the family, and so on. And it was really humiliating for him. And they publicized the recordings of what he was doing to the children. And it was one of the reasons why so many Saudis turned liberal, because these were the sheikhs that they were forced to listen to. And behind closed doors, this is what they were doing to their own families. So sometimes when you take a case to a judge and he sympathizes with the abuser, believe me when I tell you, it's because they're like that. And you can also identify a parent who abuses their children when they are a preacher and they only emphasize on the rights of parents and not the rights of children. So if you notice, a lot of staunch Salafis, when they speak about the rights of family members, they always emphasize the rights of the parents and never the children. They might give very little attention to the rights of children, but the rights of parents are always amplified because parents have a position of authority and they love to enslave their children. So children are sources of supply. So they have to drill it in people and children that it's very important to obey your parents. You can't say no to your parents. You can't do this. You can't do that, or you'll go to hell. If your parent dies and they're not pleased with you, that's it. your life is finished, it's over, you're going to hellfire. They drill that fear into children because of the authority they want to have as parents. But they never do the same the other way round. They never scream and shout at parents and tell them how to fear Allah in their children because their children have rights. How often is it do you hear, all of these sheikhs really having a go at parents for neglecting their children and not raising them properly, not raising them with love and care and attention and the right education and, giving them that quality time? You hardly hear it. It only comes from the empathic preachers and scholars, but not the ones who are narcissistic. Narcissistic preachers will never focus on the rights of those who are under the care of those in authority because they love the power and control they have over them. So they would rather women and children don't know their rights so that they don't stand up to their abusers. They always emphasize on the rights of those who are in authority. And this is a big indication that the preacher is narcissistic. The next question is, what do you think of Sufism? So, I love the spiritual aspect of Sufism. It teaches you how to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in nature and how to really, form that spiritual bond with Him. However, you've got to be careful with Sufism because there are different levels of it and there are shirk practices in Sufism, especially when it comes to the way they treat their sheikhs, because they're treated like prophets and they are seen as middlemen to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they are given a very high status in Sufism as pious people when actually I've come across some Sufi sheikhs who are very corrupt people. So because they're treated as saints and given a status they're not meant to have, they can fall into a lot of shirk because of this. And some Sufi practices are also considered to be bid'ah, innovations, in the way they worship, in the way they do dhikr, the dancing and all of that. It's not a part of Islamic practice, according to the Sunnah, and some of it can be quite physically extreme. And you also have some Sufis who deal with magic. Okay, so they interact with the jinn, and this is forbidden in Islam. So I'm not saying all Sufis are like this. I'm saying there are levels of Sufism, and the higher you go, the more complex it becomes, and the more they deviate from the true meaning of Islam. But your average Sufis, very nice people, I love them. They're very calm, humble and soft people. And I like listening to their Islamic lectures as well, when their preachers speak, because they have a wonderful way of conveying Islamic messages and lessons to learn from stories of the prophets. The next question is, my uncle who is a top sheikh sexually abused me as a child. Why did he not get publicly exposed by Allah when I complained about him? I am angry because my parents didn't do anything. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish people in ways you don't see. Okay? Maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished this uncle in his wealth, in his health, in his children and so on. Maybe he repented later from his acts. So there are certain reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not expose someone in public, and there's wisdom behind it that we don't know. We have to accept the divine decree, and the best you can do as an adult is seek therapy for what you went through. Okay, go through it with a therapist. Not everyone will get exposed in public. The people who get exposed in public are those who usually involve people outside of the family in their sins, because this person is now a danger to children. He's a predator to women. And of course, women can be predators as well. But it's usually when the sins are committed in public, and people need to be aware of him. However, when sins are committed inside the home, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala usually conceals those sins from the public because He wants them to be resolved in the home. And that's why it's forbidden for people to spread the secrets of family members in public. And if you need to do that, go to the relevant authorities who will deal with it in a professional way. Otherwise, it just gets spread around as gossip and slander, and people love to add their spices to it. So it started off as sahih and it ended up as da'if. So just be very wary of what you expose, because it can backfire on you as well. You know, if you expose your uncle for being a child abuser, it's not good for you either. It's best for you to conceal that so you don't become the talk of the town as well. So just leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and definitely work through this with a therapist, because this is something that happened in your childhood. So if you're still suffering from it and you're still angry about it, then it's best that you talk it through. And in regards to your parents, unfortunately, there are so many parents who know that there are men in their families who are child abusers, but they have to keep quiet because they worry about the reputation of the family. They worry about the reputation of the abuser, who might be a Quran teacher, who might be a preacher on TV, and so on. So it's out of protection, and they don't want a scandal to come out of it, and they don't want to get dragged through it. And I'm not saying it's right, but they're considering the greater harm that could be caused if these abusers and their families were to be exposed, so they stay silent. And it's wrong, especially when they turn a blind eye to abuse happening to their own children. Sometimes it's the father, like I said, it's the father who rapes his own daughters, and the mother turns a blind eye to that. It happens a lot. And then the children get traumatized, but the mother doesn't know what to do. She's either narcissistic herself and doesn't care, or she genuinely doesn't know what to do. She's terrified, and she's avoiding it by turning a blind eye and not addressing it. So I did address this at the beginning of the podcast, where I mentioned that it's important for family members to stand up for justice, even if it's against each other, to resolve these issues, problems. And therapy would be your best option for you to understand what happened and hopefully heal from it, inshallah. The next question is, how do I teach my children about narcissistic Quran teachers without traumatizing them? So it's important to teach children about piety, and that it's not in how you dress, what you look like, how religious you might appear, or in your words. It's in your actions and in your character. So encourage your children to always speak to you about their day at school, when they go to the mosque, if they go to a Quran teacher. Talk to them, ask them about the character of their teachers, and teach them what's right and what's wrong. Teach them what's okay and what's not okay when it comes to their relationship with their teachers. And teach them that just because someone has a beard, or wears a thob, or looks religious, or she wears the hijab, doesn't mean that she's a good person. Teach them how to assess if someone's character is good or not. And always ask them if they feel comfortable being around a certain person. So as long as you teach children that they have to have boundaries with everyone, and if something happens that they're not comfortable with, to immediately report it to you, they'll be fine, inshallah. Okay? Always teach them that Islam is not about what you look like. It's about how great your character is and how that reflects on your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many adults who weren't taught this as children grew up to be scammed a lot by people who appear religious. One of my family members bought a property in Saudi many years ago, and it was one of those projects that, wasn't complete yet. So they were selling the properties before they were built, but they would show you a plan of what the properties would look like, and if you buy them before they're complete, then you'll get a great discount on them. So loads of people were buying these properties because they were affordable as first-time homes. And the owner of this particular project had an office, and people would go and meet him in his office, and he would have this appearance of a sheikh. So he had his thob and his big beard and his subha in his hand. And they said that whenever they went to see him in his office, as soon as someone walks in, he's like, astaghfirullah, 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 on the subha. And he wanted people to think of him as a very pious man. So he got lots of contracts signed because people trusted him. And once all the properties had been bought, he disappeared. And he disappeared before he gave them the paperwork for the properties to prove that they are the owners. So within a month, they found out that he had sold the entire project to someone else. So this person now owned all the properties under his name and he had the paperwork. So he scammed all of these people out of the properties they'd bought and sold the whole thing again to this guy so he could get double profits. Now it's been 18 years and the case still hasn't been resolved in the court because he has connections and he's bribed the judge. And this came out later. One of the lawyers found out that the judge who is in charge of the case has been paid off. So the guy was found and arrested, but they let him go. And that's when the lawyers started to investigate what happened to him and why he wasn't brought to trial. And it's an ongoing case. So there's a lot of corruption like this, and people are getting fooled by people who appear so religious. They're like, oh no, he can't scam us. He looks so pious. He looks so religious. That's what they want you to believe, so you trust them. And scammers tell each other this. They rely on people's naivety. And they say, just dress up like a sheikh. Dress up like you're a preacher. Hold your subha and just sit there saying, astaghfirullah, alhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, and they'll trust you. They'll be like, oh, he can't be a scammer. They tell each other this. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala detests the hypocrites. So you've got to be careful when you come across people who have a very strong religious identity. Before you jump in out of naivety, assess the person's character first. And a lot of people get scammed by women as well who do this. I've had people come to me and tell me that they were groomed by staunch Salafi women or staunch Sufi women in mosques. And these victims were usually young women or revert women. And what these women do is they will hook you up with their vile, abusive male relatives, and they won't tell you that these men are abusive or anything like that, because they're actually struggling to get married in the community because people know they've been to jail, that they're criminals, that, there's something seriously wrong with them. They might be broke in and out of jobs or just horrible people. So these women groom the naive women and get them to marry their male relatives. And they get rewarded by these male relatives for it, right? They get money out of it sometimes, they get favours, or just praise. So I used to see it in mosques where the women who run the halaqas or women who are Quran teachers would always approach the revert sisters in the mosque, and it wasn't always with good intention. A lot of Shia women do this as well. So if you're a revert, you've got to be really careful, because you are going to be the first target when it comes to women introducing you to their abusive male relatives. Could be their husbands as well. You might be chosen as a second wife for her vile husband. Don't jump into marriage just because someone has recommended someone to you. You've got to be really careful. They will be so nice to you, so sweet to you, and they'll offer to teach you about Islam and, come to my home, and it's too much. They love bomb you. If you feel love bombed by a woman who just wants to be around you all the time or help you, and then all of a sudden she's talking about marriage, big red flag. Be careful. It could end in disaster. Just focus on your worship and learning about Islam. Never jump into marriage when you are a new revert, especially when you're marrying someone you know nothing about. A lot of these criminals and rejects in societies look for revert women who don't know anything about their reputation in the community. So it's best that you take your time when getting married or considering someone for marriage, and marry someone who you know the character of well. I promise you, I know women who were introduced to their husbands this way, and most of them left Islam. That's what my whole PhD thesis is about. Loads of women left Islam because of the abuse they went through with the men who were male relatives of the women who groomed them in mosques and Islamic centres and various Islamic events. So there will be plenty of good women out there who have genuine intentions towards reverts and young women. They do want to help you, but they won't mention marriage. They won't try to hook you up with anyone. They will have your best interests at heart, and they will tell you to not rush into these things. And this leads me to the last question, which is, why are Muslim hypocrites worse than the kuffar if they don't commit shirk? Okay, it's a good question. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Munafiqun, إِذَا جَاءَكَ الْمُنَافِقُونَ قَالُوا نَشْهَدُ إِنَّكَ لَرَسُولُ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ إِنَّكَ لَرَسُولُهُ وَاللَّهُ يَشْهَدُ إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ لَكَاذِبُونَ. When the hypocrites come to you, O Prophet, they say, we bear witness that you are certainly the messenger of Allah, and surely Allah knows that you are his messenger, but Allah bears witness that the hypocrites are truly liars. اتخذوا أيمانهم جنة فصدوا عن سبيل الله إنهم ساء ما كانوا يعملون. They have made their false oaths as a shield, hindering others from the way of Allah. Evil indeed is what they do. So Allah tells us here that these people aren't believers. Okay? Hypocrites are people who have satanic agendas. And people who have satanic agendas can't be people who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if they say the shahada, the belief is not there. It's just a verbal thing that they say, but their actions say otherwise. And they are the worst of people because they confuse people the most. So they look like Muslims, they sound like Muslims, but they act in a way that shows that they don't believe that a day of judgment is coming. And they act with no fear of Allah. These are oppressive people. They say one thing and do another. And because of their facade, people trust them. And these are the people who scam them the most. So when you have a disbeliever in front of you, you know who you're dealing with. He's very clear or she's very clear in their beliefs, and you know that this person is not a believer. But when you have a hypocrite in front of you, you can't tell. So the harm that comes from a hypocrite is 10 times worse than that which comes from a disbeliever, because there's a lot of deception here. The covert narcissist is the one who plots to harm you or destroy you, but they have that sweet smile on their face. So you don't see it coming. You don't see the scam coming. You don't see the abuse coming. It's like, when you marry someone and you think they're pious and wonderful and religious, and once you're married, it's a different story. They turn into a monster from your worst nightmares. That's the hypocrite. And they are the worst of people because they are the ones who ruin the reputation of Islam. Right? These abusers, these narcissists, these psychopaths who come across as being religious, and they're doing all sorts of vile things in public and in private, they are the ones who have made many non-Muslims hate Islam and have a terrible perception of it. And because of them, they would never convert to Islam. Like, you want us to convert to a religion where people commit honor killings and hate non-Muslims, and they start to mention all the fatwas that they hear from staunch religious preachers. It puts them off Islam. This is their job from Iblis. Okay, it's their satanic mission. Psychopaths, narcissists, covert narcissists, all of them, they're on a satanic mission to ruin the reputation of Islam. And this is why they are dangerous. They also drive people out of Islam. So if you are already Muslim, then their abuse, their hypocrisy, their enforcement of strict rulings that are suffocating and oppressive, they all cause people to leave Islam. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dedicated a whole surah to the hypocrites, because it's an identity we need to be aware of in the Muslim community. If they are tainting the beautiful message of Islam with their ugly practices and attitudes, and if they are driving people out of Islam because of their understanding of it and their abuse and their oppression, then know there is a severe punishment for them in this world and the hereafter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, verse 145, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ مِنَ النَّارِ وَلَن تَجِدَ لَهُمْ نَصِيرًا. Surely the hypocrites will be in the lowest depths of the fire, and you will never find for them any helper. So in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala favors the kafir over the munafiq, because of how much damage the munafiq can cause to Islam, and how people see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how people see the Prophet ﷺ, and how Muslims are treated in general, right? So if anyone taints the beautiful message of Islam, then they will have to face the punishment and be accountable for it. And they will also be accountable for everyone they drove out of Islam and everyone they put off converting to Islam, and everyone who harmed Muslims with Islamophobic attacks as a result of their actions and how they portrayed Islam that triggered Islamophobic attacks on regular people who are innocent. So all of that will be a very heavy weight to carry on the Day of Judgment. So that's the end of the Q&A. I hope you found it beneficial. Please do like the podcast if you found it helpful. Do share it with others whom you feel could benefit from this information. And do subscribe to the channel or sign up to the newsletter on the website if you'd like to be informed about future podcast releases. If you need one-to-one counselling and coaching, you can click the link below in the description box to fill out a form, and I'll get back to you inshallah, or you can email me directly. My email address is below. Thank you for listening until now if you're still with me. I'm starting to lose my voice now, so it's a good time to end it. Please do remember me in your du'as, and inshallah until the next podcast, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.